I never thought I would be sitting here, telling the world the story of how my entire life got flipped upside down, because my parents forced me into a marriage I wanted absolutely nothing to do with. And I mean forced. Not in a gentle, sweetheart, we really think you should give this man a chance kind of way, but in a cold, transactional, you will do this or you are no longer our daughter kind of way. The man they chose for me was everything I had been told to avoid. He was older than me by almost a decade. He had a young child from a previous relationship. He lived in a modest house on the edge of a quiet, unremarkable neighborhood. He drove a car that had clearly seen better days. He wore plain clothes, worked long hours, and from everything I could see, he was just barely holding his life together as a single father trying to raise a little girl on his own. I was a 26-year-old woman with a master's degree, a blossoming career in marketing, and plans, real plans, for my future. And my parents wanted me to throw all of that away for a man named Daniel. So tell me honestly, before I even get into everything that happened, was I wrong for refusing? Was I wrong for fighting back with everything I had? And when you hear the full story, every single detail of what came next, I want you to tell me in the comments below whether you would have done the same thing I did. Because I promise you, by the end of this, your jaw is going to be on the floor. Let me take you all the way back to the beginning, because you need to understand who I am and where I came from to fully appreciate just how surreal this entire situation was. My name is Serena, and I grew up in a moderately wealthy family in a mid-sized city, where reputation and appearances meant everything to my parents. My father ran a successful import business, and my mother was deeply embedded in the social circles of our community. Charity events, dinner parties, the whole performance. From the time I was a little girl, I was groomed, not just to be educated and accomplished, but to be a perfect reflection of our family's image. I did everything right. I studied hard, went to a good university, earned my graduate degree, and landed a solid job at a marketing firm, where I was genuinely climbing the ladder. I had my own apartment, my own income, my own life. I had even been in a serious relationship for 2 years with a man named Marcus, who was charming, ambitious, and completely wrong for me in ways I wouldn't fully understand until much later. But that is a story for another time. What matters is that by the time I was 26, I was living independently, and I was proud of that. My parents, however, had a different vision for my life. In our culture and in our family, a woman reaching her mid-20s without a husband was a source of quiet embarrassment. My mother would drop comments at family gatherings, little needles disguised as concern, about how I was so focused on work and how she just hoped I wouldn't wait too long. My father was more direct. He sat me down one evening after dinner, the way he always did when he wanted to have a serious conversation, and he told me plainly that he had been speaking with the family of a man named Daniel Holt, that Daniel was a respectable and hard-working man, and that he believed this would be a good match. I laughed. I actually laughed, because I thought he was joking. He was not joking. Over the following weeks, I learned everything about Daniel that my parents thought was relevant. He was 34 years old. He had been married once before, briefly, and his ex-wife had left when their daughter, Lily, was only 18 months old. Lily was now 5. Daniel raised her alone. He worked as some kind of consultant. My parents were vague about the specifics, which I found odd but didn't press at the time, and he lived simply and quietly. When I pushed for more details, my mother showed me a photo. He was not unattractive. Dark hair, calm eyes, a quiet kind of face that didn't give much away. But none of that mattered to me. What mattered was that I was being asked, no, told, to consider marrying a man I had never met, who had a child, who was nearly a decade older than me, and whose life was, by every visible measure, modest at best. I refused. Clearly, firmly, and repeatedly. I told my parents that I respected their concern for my future, but that I was perfectly capable of finding my own partner in my own time. My mother cried. My father went quiet in that dangerous way he had. And for a few weeks, I thought that was the end of it. I went back to my apartment, back to my job, back to my life. But my parents were not done. What followed was a campaign of pressure that I can only describe as relentless. Family members called me. Aunts, uncles, cousins I barely spoke to, were suddenly reaching out to tell me I was being selfish and ungrateful. My mother stopped speaking to me for 2 weeks. My father called me one night and told me, in a voice so calm it frightened me, that he had already made commitments to Daniel's family, that our family's word was on the line, and that if I continued to refuse, I would be cutting myself off from the family entirely. He meant financially, socially, and emotionally. He meant it completely. I want to pause here and be honest with you about something, because I think it is important. The pressure my parents used was not physical. They did not lock me in a room or threaten me with violence, but there is a kind of coercion that does not leave bruises and is no less real for it. When everything you have, your family, your community, your sense of belonging, is placed on one side of a scale, and a stranger's name is placed on the other, and you are told to choose, that is not a free choice. That is a trap with a soft lining. And I, exhausted and heartbroken by the months of conflict, made what I told myself was a temporary compromise. I agreed to meet Daniel. Just meet him. One dinner, and then I would have grounds to say I had tried. We met at a small Italian restaurant that my parents chose. I showed up 10 minutes late on purpose, wearing an expression I had carefully arranged to communicate polite indifference. Daniel was already there, sitting at the table, and he stood when I walked over. He was taller than I expected. He had that same calm in his face that the photo had shown. But in person, there was something else underneath it. A kind of tiredness that I recognized, the kind that comes not from laziness, but from carrying a heavy load for a long time alone. He shook my hand. He did not try to charm me. He did not perform. He simply said, "I know this is a strange situation. I appreciate you coming." And then he sat down and picked up his menu. That was it. No flattery, no nerves, no agenda. I was simultaneously disarmed and more irritated than ever, because it would have been much easier to dismiss him if he had been awful. We talked through dinner. He asked me about my work, genuinely asked, and actually listened to my answers, rather than waiting for his turn to speak. I asked him about his daughter, and that is when something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, not in a movie kind of way, but the tiredness softened, and something warmer came through. He told me about Lily, how she had recently decided that her favorite color was the color of rain, how she was obsessed with a picture book about a girl who befriends a lighthouse, how she asked him every single night before bed whether the stars could hear her if she whispered. I found myself listening without meaning to. I found myself almost smiling. I stopped almost immediately and reminded myself why I was there. I went home that night and told my parents the dinner was fine. The man was acceptable, and I still did not want to marry him. They told me the arrangements were already being made. I cannot fully describe the feeling of that moment. The way the floor seemed to tilt slightly beneath me. Over the next several weeks, as my protests continued to fall on deaf ears and the social machinery of my family and community ground forward, without my consent, I arrived at a decision. If they were going to force this, I would go through with it outwardly while doing everything in my power to reclaim my life afterward. I would marry Daniel. I would be civil. I would not make a scene. And I would quietly, methodically, build my escape. The wedding was small and simple, which I was grateful for. Daniel wore a dark suit. I wore a dress my mother had chosen. Lily was there in a little blue outfit, holding a small bunch of flowers that she had clearly picked herself from somewhere, because they were already slightly wilted. When the officiant asked if I took this man, I said yes with a voice that I kept very steady. Daniel looked at me when I said it, and I could not read his expression, and I looked away. We moved into his house 2 weeks later. It was a clean, unpretentious home with a small garden that Lily had decorated with painted rocks. My life, I told myself, was temporarily on hold. The first month was a careful, polite negotiation of space and routine. Daniel woke early, got Lily ready for school, left for work, came home, made dinner, helped with homework, put Lily to bed, and then sat quietly in the living room, reading or working on his laptop. He asked nothing of me beyond basic courtesy. He did not demand affection or performance. He gave me space with a consistency that I initially interpreted as indifference, but gradually began to suspect was actually a form of respect. Lily, on the other hand, had no interest in giving me space. She was 5 years old and completely without guile. She knocked on my bedroom door the third morning I was there and asked if I wanted to see her collection of interesting rocks. I said yes before I could stop myself. And so, slowly, without my permission, a life began to assemble itself around me. I would drive Lily to school on the mornings Daniel had early calls. I would sometimes find a cup of tea on the counter, made exactly the way I had mentioned once in passing that I liked it, and I would know Daniel had made it before leaving. Small things. Quiet things. The kind of things you don't write poems about, but that settle into your daily existence and make it feel, against your will, like home. And then, about 3 months in, something happened that cracked open the careful compartment I had built around my emotions. Lily got sick. Not dangerously sick, but sick enough. A fever that spiked in the night and frightened her. Daniel was away on what he called a work trip, and I was alone with her. I called him in a panic and he talked me through it. Calm and clear on the phone, telling me exactly what to do, and I did it. And Lily's fever came down, and she fell asleep with her hand curled around my fingers. I sat there in the dim light of her room for a long time afterward, looking at this small person, who had not asked for any of the difficulty her life had handed her, and I felt something in my chest come completely undone. So that is where I was. 3 months into a marriage I had not chosen, sitting in the dark next to a child who was not mine, feeling things I had not budgeted for, and I had to make a choice about what to do next. Before I tell you what happened, I want you to pause right now and drop a comment below. What would you have done in my position? Would you have kept your walls up and stuck to the plan? Or would you have let yourself feel something real? Tell me, because what I decided changed everything, and I mean everything, in ways I could not have imagined even in my wildest dreams. I chose to stop running. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not a conversation or a confrontation. It was simply a decision I made privately, in that rocking chair in Lily's room, to stop treating my own life like a sentence I was serving, and start paying attention to what was actually in front of me. I started talking to Daniel. Really talking, not the careful, courteous exchanges we had managed before. I asked him about his work, and he answered with the same quiet honesty he brought to everything, though I noticed he was sometimes deliberately vague about the details, in a way that struck me as strange. I asked him once, half joking, whether he was secretly a spy. He smiled, and it was the first time I had seen him smile fully, without reservation, and said, "Nothing that interesting." I thought nothing more of it. It was Lily who accidentally told me the truth. Children have no concept of secrets they have not been specifically instructed to keep. We were in the car one afternoon, Lily in the back seat, chattering about her day, when she mentioned, completely without ceremony, that her daddy's office was the really tall building downtown, the one with the big letters on top. I asked her which building she meant. She described it, and I felt the world tilt again, because the building she described, the one with the big letters on top in the center of our city's financial district, was the headquarters of Holt Meridian Group, one of the largest privately held investment and development firms in the country. A company I had literally studied in a business strategy course during my master's program. A company whose founder and CEO was listed in financial publications as one of the wealthiest individuals in the nation. A company whose founder's name was listed as D. Holt. I sat with that for 3 days before I said anything. I went through the stages you would expect. Disbelief, then frantic internet research, then a kind of dizzy spinning confusion that I could not organize into words. The modest house, the plain clothes, the ordinary car, the careful vagueness about his work. All of it rearranged itself in front of me, into a picture I had not been able to see before, because I had not been looking from the right angle. Daniel Holt was not a struggling single father. Daniel Holt was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinarily, almost incomprehensibly wealthy. And he had chosen to live the way he lived. Chosen it deliberately. Because he was raising a daughter and he did not want her growing up surrounded by the performance of wealth rather than the substance of love. I knew this before I even asked him, because by then I knew him well enough to understand that this was exactly the kind of decision he would make. When I finally brought it up, we were sitting in the garden after Lily had gone to bed. I asked him directly. I said, "Daniel, is your company Holt Meridian Group?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said yes. I asked him why he had never told me. He was quiet for a while. And then he said something I have turned over in my mind many times since. He said, "Because I needed to know that whoever was in my life was there because of me. Because of who I actually am. And not because of what I own. I've seen what happens when people love a version of you that's built on money. I didn't want that for Lily. And I didn't want it for myself." I thought about the tea on the counter. I thought about Lily's painted rocks. I thought about him talking me through a fever in the middle of the night, with a voice like still water. And I thought about myself, the woman who had arrived in this house furious and armored and absolutely certain she was the victim of this story. And I realized I had been given something I had not asked for and did not deserve and had received anyway. The chance to love someone for exactly who they were, with no information to distort it. No wealth, no status, no impressive biography. Just a tired man doing his best for his daughter, and quietly, patiently, making room for me. The weeks that followed brought their own unfolding. I learned the scope of what Daniel had built. Not from him, but from the world that had always been there and that I now had eyes to see. The meetings he took quietly on his laptop in the evenings. The calls he handled with an authority and precision that I had admired without understanding. The way other people deferred to him in ways so subtle I had missed them entirely. None of it changed who he was in the house, with Lily, with me. He was the same man. That was the thing that broke through every remaining wall I had. He was exactly the same. My parents, when they eventually learned the full truth, and they did learn it, through the grapevine of our community, in a spectacular fashion that I confess I did not entirely hate, were speechless for possibly the first time in their lives. My mother called me crying, though whether from relief, embarrassment, or something approaching genuine emotion, I was never entirely sure. My father called to say he was glad it had worked out. I told him it had worked out in spite of him, not because of him, and that we would need to have a longer conversation about that at some point. We have since had that conversation. It was hard and honest and necessary, and we are slowly in a better place. Lily asked me one evening, about 6 months after I had moved in, whether I was going to stay. She asked it the way children ask things, directly, without cushion, looking at me with those enormous, serious eyes. I told her yes. She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her book. That was it. That was the whole exchange. But I will tell you honestly that it was one of the most significant moments of my life. I am not going to stand here, or sit here, in front of this camera, and tell you that everything was perfect after that, because it was not. Building a real marriage from a forced beginning requires a level of honesty and humility and work that nobody warns you about. There were hard conversations. There were moments when my old anger resurfaced, and I had to choose, consciously and effortfully, to put it down. There were moments when Daniel's privacy, his habit of holding things close, frustrated me enormously, and I had to learn to ask instead of assume. None of it was a fairy tale. All of it was real. And real, I have learned, is so much more valuable than the version of a perfect life I had been chasing. What this story taught me, what I carry with me now, is something I did not expect to learn from a marriage I never wanted. It is this: the life we plan is not always the life that is meant for us. Sometimes the detour is the destination. Sometimes the person who does not fit our picture of what we imagined is the person who sees us most clearly. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, being forced off your intended path lands you somewhere so much better than where you were headed that you cannot imagine having stayed on the road you chose. If you were on my side through this whole story, if you understand why I fought, why I resented, and why I eventually chose to open my heart anyway, please like this video. It means more than you know to have people who get it. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something or think about your own life and choices, please subscribe, because I share stories like this one regularly, and every single one of them is real and raw and human. Drop your final thoughts in the comments. I mean everything. Whether you think my parents deserve forgiveness, Whether you would have run or stayed. Whether you think Daniel was right to hide who he was, or whether you think the whole arrangement was wrong from the start. I read every single comment and I want to know what you think. This community is built on honest conversation, and I am grateful for every one of you who is part of it. I'll see you all in the next story.